Hello, and this is the last video giving you your feedback from the week 13 discussions about the Civil War. This is based on the source, which was Gooding's letter to Abraham Lincoln asking for equal pay for African American soldiers. The first question asked, why, in Gooding's view, should African American soldiers receive equal pay to whites? Well, he makes 2 points. One is that they are soldiers, not laborers. Early in the war, African Americans had been hired only as laborers, were not trusted to do the actual fighting. By the time that Gooding is referring to, African American soldiers were being employed on the front lines. And the second point he makes is they've served the same way as white soldiers. They've suffered the same risks. They've been wounded and died. Their families have mourned them in exactly the same way as happened for white soldiers. Therefore, they should be treated equally to white soldiers. The second question asked, how did Gooding use the history of the war to make his case? Well, again, he refers back to the earlier states where the African American soldiers were only used as laborers. He said that they wanted to fight, but they were turned down by the country and made to work in these menial positions. And he cites the names of battles where African Americans have died. Once they were given the opportunity to fight, they laid down their lives just as white soldiers did. And he says, quotes, "We have done a soldier's duty, why can't we have a soldier's pay?" He also makes the point that the US government is demanding the Confederates treat black and white soldiers equally. The Confederates treated black soldiers as if they were runaway slaves and could be returned to slavery or even just killed. The Confederates did not treat them as prisoners of war in the way that they did the white soldiers. And Gooding says, well, if the government demands that the Confederation treat black and white soldiers equally, how can they then not themselves treat black and white soldiers equally? The third question asked, what distinction does Gooding make between ex-slaves and free blacks such as himself? He makes the argument, we were not enlisted under any contraband act. What this means is that earlier in the war, before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union had to deal with the question of what to do with runaway slaves from the South. Technically, they were meant to send them back under the the Fugitive Slaves Act, but clearly they weren't going to do so once the war had begun. So they determined that they were contraband of war. The rules of war allowed you to use property, and as the South treated the African American slaves as property, the Union, as it were, called their bluff and said, well, if you say they're property, then we're going to treat them as property. We're not going to send them back to you to be slaves. And so they employed them working for the Union armies in a sort of a situation. They weren't free, but they weren't slaves anymore. And Gooding says we weren't like this. We weren't menial servants. And while he's keen to make sure he's not disparaging the service of the former slaves, he's saying we joined up of our own free will. We're not guardians of the government put to work by the government. We are free to do this. We are free to think and act for ourselves, and we chose to act to run the risks of the battlefield to fight for the Union and to fight for our freedom.